Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my HOA Karen Tales channel? Thank you so much. A cool breeze whispered through the towering pines as David Harrington pulled onto the familiar dirt road, his tires crunching over the gravel path that led to his grandfather's old cabin. The last time he had been here, he was just a lost student sitting on the porch with his grandfather, discussing justice, legacy, and the importance of standing up for what's right. This cabin wasn't just a structure. It was the heart of his childhood, a place where he learned life's hardest lessons, a place where memories still lingered in the walls. But as he turned the last bend, the sight that greeted him made his heart stop. The cabin was gone, not burned, not damaged, completely wiped from existence. The land, once rich with nostalgia, was now an empty, bulldozed patch of dirt. A neatly printed sign stood in the center of the destruction. Future site of Oj Community Green Space. HOA approved. David slammed the car door shut, his pulse pounding his ears, his hands clenched into fists as he took slow, measured steps toward where the front porch should have been. His boots sank slightly into the disturbed soil. He bent down, running his fingers through the dirt as if trying to grasp the past that had been ripped away. There were no ruins, no debris, just flattened earth. They hadn't just demolished the cabin. They had erased it. A sudden wave of fury surged through him. Who had authorized this? Who had dared to touch what belonged to him? As if on cue, the sound of footsteps crunched behind him. A man in expensive polo shirt and khaki shorts stood with his arms crossed, watching David with a smug smile. "You must be new here," the man said casually. "This area is under the jurisdiction of the Oj Homeowners Association. We're revitalizing the community." That old shack wasn't up to code. David turned slowly, his gaze locking onto the man's face, memorizing it. "That old shack," he said evenly, "was my grandfather's cabin. My land." The man's smirk didn't fade. "Oh well, according to our records, the property was absorbed into the HOA's jurisdiction last year. We sent multiple notices about the upcoming improvements. The land is now part of a community project." David felt his fingers twitch with the urge to wipe that arrogance off the man's face, but years of courtroom discipline held him back. He was no ordinary homeowner. He was no helpless victim. Who approved this? His voice was dangerously calm. "That would be the HOA board, of course." The man extended a hand. "Gerald Whitman, HOA president. You can file a complaint if you want, but frankly, you're out of luck. This is a done deal." David didn't shake his hand. Instead, he took a step closer, just enough that Whitman's confidence flickered for the briefest second. "You bulldozed my property," David said, his voice cold. "Without my consent, without legal authority." Whitman chuckled, shaking his head. "That's where you're wrong. The HOA always has authority here." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket and handed it over. "See for yourself." It was his sharp eyes scanning the document. His breath hitched. It was a sale agreement, a forged one. His signature was at the bottom. The arrogance in Whitman's eyes deepened. "So like I said, done deal. Nothing personal." David took a long, slow breath. His expression gave nothing away, but inside, something dark and unwavering settled in his chest. Whitman and his HOA had no idea who they had just crossed. Smiling faintly, David folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. "I'll be seeing you soon, Mr. Whitman." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. They thought they had one. They had no idea they had just declared war on the wrong man. David didn't drive straight home. Instead, he pulled into the nearest gas station parking lot, cut the engine, and pulled out his phone. The forged sale agreement burned in his pocket, but he needed more than just his own word to take the fight to the HOA. He needed facts, evidence, and a clear understanding of how deep this corruption ran. His first call was to the county recorder's office. After some back and forth, a tired-sounding clerk confirmed that a property transfer had indeed been processed in his name. The document had been notarized and registered last year, but David had never signed anything. "Who notarized the document?" he asked, gripping the steering wheel. The clerk hesitated. "Marcus Grayson." The name sent a ripple of recognition through David's mind. Marcus Grayson was a well-known but notoriously corrupt real estate attorney, infamous for finding legal loopholes to push aggressive property takeovers. His involvement meant this wasn't just an overzealous HOA. It was a premeditated land grab. David ended the call and exhaled slowly. He needed to get ahead of this before Whitman and his people realized just how badly they had screwed up. The next morning, David took an unassuming approach. He played the role of an average, powerless homeowner. He visited the HOA's main office under the pretense of understanding the process and what could be done about his situation. Inside, he found a sleek, modern space with expensive furniture more suited to a corporate headquarters than a neighborhood association. A receptionist, barely looking up from her screen, waved him toward a waiting area. A few minutes later, a different board member, Linda Reeves, greeted him with a plastic smile. "Mr. Harrington, I understand you have some concerns about your property." David studied her, noting the too perfect politeness, the rehearsed charm. She was good, but not good enough. "I just want to understand how this happened," he said, keeping his tone casual. "I don't recall signing anything, but somehow my land now belongs to the HOA." Linda's expression didn't shift. "We always operate within the law, Mr. Harrington. If the transfer was processed, it must have been authorized. Perhaps you signed something a while back and forgot." David forced a chuckle. "I'm sure I'd remember selling my grandfather's cabin." Smile tightened. Sometimes these things happen with older records. Paperwork can get confusing. There it was, the subtle attempt to gaslight him. David nodded thoughtfully. "And what happens if someone wanted to challenge this?" Her eyes darkened just a fraction. "Oh, that would be complicated. The HOA has significant legal resources. Fighting us could be expensive and time-consuming." She paused. "Not to mention it might be difficult to prove anything improper happened." David leaned back. "I see. This was textbook intimidation. They were used to people giving up, retirees too tired to fight, homeowners too scared to drain their savings in a legal battle." But he wasn't one of those people. David spent the rest of the day digging into public records, speaking with longtime residents, and piecing together the HOA's true game plan. The pattern was disturbingly clear. The HOA expanded its jurisdiction by quietly absorbing nearby properties through fraudulent documents, intimidation, or legal loopholes. Those who resisted were hit with bogus violations, fines, and legal threats until they complied or sold their homes for pennies. The properties were then resold at massive profits to developers with HOA connections. Some homeowners he spoke with described mysterious fees suddenly appearing on their HOA bills. Others said they received legal threats for minor infractions, a lawn being too tall, a fence being the wrong shade of brown. If they refused to pay, the HOA would escalate matters to foreclosure proceedings. It wasn't just aggressive policy. It was systematic property theft, and Gerald Whitman was at the center of it. David's next stop was City Hall. Using his judicial connections, he accessed zoning applications and HOA filings. One document caught his attention, a zoning request filed 6 months ago for a massive commercial project right where his grandfather's land used to be. The project was labeled as an eco-friendly community initiative, a fancy way of saying they were planning to sell the land to developers. This wasn't just about property control. It was about money, millions. And the biggest bombshell? The signature on the zoning application, Gerald Whitman. David stared at the document, feeling his jaw tighten. Whitman and his cronies had been playing a long game, betting that no one would notice until it was too late. They had no idea the man they had stolen from wasn't just an angry homeowner. He was a Supreme Court justice. And now he had everything he needed to burn them to the ground. David didn't waste time. The HOA thought they had buried their tracks under piles of paperwork and intimidation, but they had made a critical mistake, one that he was about to exploit. Sitting in his home office that night, he spread out every document, court filing, and HOA bylaw he had gathered. His legal mind, honed by years of dismantling unconstitutional laws, began dissecting the HOA's operations like a surgeon with a scalpel. What he found was both infuriating and hilarious. The HOA's fatal mistake, the hidden loophole. HOAs often relied on technicalities, But this particular association had failed to complete a crucial legal step according to state law. When an HOA expands its jurisdiction, it must obtain written, notarized consent from affected property owners, submit expansion approvals to the city for verification, and provide a 90-day grace period for disputes before enforcing new rules. The OHOA had skipped step 2 entirely. Their expansion was never legally approved, which meant all their fines, property seizures, and rule enforcement were technically invalid. David leaned back in his chair, a slow grin forming. They had built an empire of fraud on a foundation of sand, and he was about to kick it down. Phase 1. The legal earthquake. David knew if he struck too soon, the HOA's corrupt leadership would bury evidence and stall legal proceedings. He needed to hit them before they even saw him coming. His first move, an emergency injunction. He quietly filed a lawsuit, using his contacts to fast-track a hearing with a judge he personally knew was incorruptible. The lawsuit argued that the HOA's jurisdiction over his land was invalid. The property transfer was based on fraud, making it null and void. The HOA's financial dealings showed a pattern of unlawful land grabs, warranting a full legal audit. The next morning, the court issued a temporary restraining order against the HOA. All HOA activities, including fines, property seizures, and new developments, were frozen indefinitely. Phase 2. The psychological war. David wasn't done. He knew Whitman and his cronies thrived on fear, so he decided to turn the tables. Dressed in a casual blazer and slacks, he walked into the HOA office unannounced. Whitman was seated behind a polished mahogany desk, exuding the same smug arrogance he had shown before. "Harrington," he said, smirking, "you back for another lesson on how the HOA works?" David slid a copy of the court order across the desk. "No, I'm here to teach you a lesson." Whitman's smirk faltered. He picked up the document, skimming the lines. His face lost color as he realized what it meant. "The HOA's jurisdiction over my land is void," David said, his voice calm but sharp. "That means your so-called green space project is illegal. The construction company you hired, they're now trespassing. Every property fine and foreclosure you've issued is nullified." Whitman tried to mask his panic. "This is just a temporary ruling." David leaned in, dropping his voice just enough that only Whitman could hear. "It's the beginning of the end." Phase 3. Exposing the financial rot. David wasn't satisfied with stopping the HOA. He wanted to burn their entire operation to the ground. Using his legal access, he dug into the HOA's financial records. What he found was worse than he expected. Illegal kickbacks from real estate developers, funds siphoned into personal accounts, and fake invoices for maintenance. That never happened. It was textbook embezzlement. David compiled a full report and sent it directly to the state attorney general. The HOA's first major collapse came 3 days later. The hammer fell. The state launched an official investigation into HOA's finances. The local news got wind of the scandal, running segments on elderly residents being forced out of their homes by fraudulent tactics. Homeowners who had been bullied into compliance suddenly saw a way out and started speaking up. Whitman and his lawyer, Marcus Grayson, went into full damage control mode, calling emergency HOA meetings, trying to suppress the outrage. But it was too late. The once untouchable HOA was now bleeding from every angle, and David wasn't even finished yet. The real fight was just beginning. David knew the HOA wouldn't go down without a fight. People like Gerald Whitman and Marcus Grayson didn't just accept defeat. They schemed, retaliated, and clawed at power until they had nothing left. They were backed into a corner now, their finances under scrutiny, their fraudulent land grab exposed, and their legal authority crumbling. And that made them more dangerous than ever. The first sign of retaliation came subtly. David returned to his house one evening to find a code violation notice taped to his front door. Unauthorized structure modifications. Fine $5,000. Payment due in 7 days to avoid further action. It was laughable. He wasn't even in the HOA's jurisdiction. The next morning, he woke up to the sound of an engine revving outside. He stepped on his porch just in time to see a tow truck hooking onto his car. A man in a reflective vest gave him a smug look. "HOA orders Unpaid violations, he said. David folded his arms. You touch that car, and I'll have you arrested for grand theft auto. The man hesitated, his confidence wavering. Mr. Whitman said. David interrupted, stepping closer. Is about to be indicted for fraud. You want to go down with him? The man paled, muttered something under his breath, and unhooked the car before speeding off. It was a pathetic attempt at intimidation, but it told David one important thing. The HOA was panicking. And then things escalated. The next play was more serious. A week later, just as the legal noose was tightening around the HOA, David received a formal counter-lawsuit. The claims were absurd: defamation for spreading false allegations about the HOA, trespassing for stepping onto his own property, which they still claimed as theirs, and harassment for aggressive behavior toward HOA members. David wasn't surprised. This was a classic delay and distract strategy. If they couldn't win, they could at least drag him into endless legal battles. He read through the document carefully, then made one phone call to a journalist he had been feeding information to. The next morning, a headline ran on the front page of the local newspaper. Corrupt HOA, Supreme Court Justice who exposed them. How far will they go? Public opinion turned against them. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out started coming forward. Homeowners who had lost their properties illegally started filing their own lawsuits. The HOA board members began to fracture, some realizing the inevitable collapse, resigned, and leaked internal emails to the press. But Whitman and Grayson weren't finished with the legal battle. Failing and the HOA's credibility in tatters, they went for one final desperate move. They tried to destroy the evidence. Late one night, David received a frantic call from an anonymous tipster. You need to get to the HOA office now. David grabbed his keys and sped toward the building. By the time he arrived, smoke was already curling into the night sky. The HOA office was on fire. Flames licked at the roof, and the glow of the blaze reflected off the horrified faces of onlookers. Fire trucks screeched onto the scene, firefighters rushing to contain the damage. David stood there watching the last desperate attempt to erase the truth. But he knew something Whitman didn't. The physical documents were gone, but David had already copied every financial record, every fraudulent contract, every piece of evidence. The final blow was coming. The morning after the fire, David sat in his office sipping coffee as he reviewed the news headlines. Suspicious fire at HOA office amidst fraud investigation. HOA accused of evidence destruction. Legal fallout expected. HOA president and lawyer under criminal investigation for fraud, extortion, and arson. It was exactly what he had expected. Whitman and Grayson had made a fatal mistake. They had panicked. The fire, which was clearly an attempt to destroy evidence, had backfired spectacularly. Instead of erasing their crimes, it had triggered a full-scale criminal investigation, and David was about to land the final crushing blow. The grand jury indictment. That afternoon, David walked into the state attorney's office, briefcase in hand. Inside that briefcase was everything. Copies of the fraudulent property transfers, emails proving kickbacks between the HOA and developers, bank statements showing embezzlement of HOA funds, testimonies from victims and former HOA board members who had turned on Whitman and Grayson. The state attorney didn't even hesitate. Within 48 hours, a grand jury was convened, and by the end of the week, formal charges were filed. Whitman and Grayson were indicted for white-collar fraud, white-collar forgery, white-collar conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, white-collar embezzlement, white-collar extortion, and white-collar arson, pending further investigation. Their assets were frozen, their phones seized, and their freedom officially numbered. The HOA's total collapse. As soon as the charges became public, the remaining HOA board members turned on each other. Some tried to distance themselves, pretending they had no knowledge of the crimes. Others lawyered up, hoping to cut deals. It didn't matter. The court ruled that every fraudulent HOA rule and fine was void. That meant every illegally seized home was returned to its rightful owner. Every fraudulent fine and fee was refunded. Every bogus foreclosure was reversed. The HOA's entire structure collapsed overnight. The final quorum showdown. Whitman and Grayson still tried to fight. They hired expensive lawyers, claiming they were innocent, that this was all a misunderstanding. But the case was airtight. The judge laughed them out of court. David, standing in the courtroom as the verdict was read, watched as justice was served. Whitman was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Grayson, the corrupt lawyer, got 10 years and lost his license to practice law. The HOA was officially dissolved. It was over. David had taken on the corrupt HOA and won. The symbolic end. A few weeks later, David returned to the land that was once his grandfather's cabin. It was no longer a green space project. It was his again. Standing on the empty land, he closed his eyes and imagined the old porch, the smell of wood smoke, the echoes of his grandfather's voice. Then he made a decision. He rebuilt the cabin, not just as a home, but as a symbol, a reminder that justice isn't just about laws. It's about standing up when no one else will. And when corruption rises, sometimes all it takes is one person willing to fight back. A year after the downfall of the HOA, the land where David's grandfather's cabin once stood had been restored to its rightful state. The new cabin was an almost exact replica of the one his grandfather had built decades ago, but with modern touches, reinforced walls, solar panels, and a porch swing where David could sit and drink coffee as he watched the sunset. It was peaceful now. No more threatening notices taped to doors. No more corrupt board members extorting homeowners. No more HOA tyranny. The community, once under Whitman's oppressive rule, had regained its independence. Some residents had moved away, others had stayed, and a few even gathered to celebrate the final court ruling that officially disbanded the HOA forever. David, however, had no interest in the spotlight. He had won, but this wasn't about fame. It was about restoring what was lost. And yet, just when he thought it was over, life had one more surprise in store for him, an unexpected guest. One quiet evening, as he sat on his newly built porch, a black sedan pulled onto the gravel driveway. David straightened, watching as the car door opened. A woman in a navy blue business suit stepped out, her heels crunching against the gravel. She carried a thin leather briefcase, her posture exuding confidence and urgency. She was a lawyer. David could tell from the way she moved. "Justice Harrington?" she asked, stopping at the foot of the porch steps. David gave a slow nod. "Depends on who's asking." She smiled faintly, but there was something serious in her eyes. "My name is Emily Carter. I represent a group of homeowners in Lakewood Hills, 2 states over. They've been fighting against a corrupt HOA for years, but the courts have refused to take their case seriously." She paused, tilting her head slightly. "They need someone who can help, someone with the experience and influence to take the fight all the way to the top." David leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Let me guess," he said, amusement flickering in his voice. "They thought no one would fight back." Emily nodded, and so far, they've been right. David exhaled slowly, looking out at the land his grandfather had fought to keep, the home that had been stolen and reclaimed. For a moment, he considered turning her down, but then he thought about the families trapped under another HOA's control, the elderly homeowners being bullied out of their homes, the corruption repeating itself over and over again. He had the power to stop it. David stood up, offering his hand. "Tell me everything." Emily shook it, her grip firm. "I was hoping you'd say that." As she walked back to her car, David glanced at the fading sunset and let out a small, knowing smirk. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning.